Good to see you all again. So I was here last September, I believe, for Ruby Shift. Was anyone at Ruby Shift? Yeah. I actually recognise a bunch of you. It's good to see you again. It's great to be back in Kiev for Ruby C. So yeah, so if any of you were at Ruby Shift last year, you'll know this guy. He's a good friend of mine. He likes to have a drink. So you know, last year at Ruby Shift, the last evening, shall we say, and this guy knows about this as well, was interesting. It ended well. Had a very early flight to catch in the morning, which was a bit of a headache. But got home eventually, and of course I'm standing here now in front of you, about to present. So yeah, so I love Kiev. Last year, again, at Ruby Shift, had a really great time. I found you all really, really hospitable. The after party was great, conference was great, and you're a really cool bunch of people. And it's great to be standing in front of you. Thank you. So last night, we had, a bunch of the speakers went out to grab some dinner, and we went on the metro. But of course, first we had to go down the elevator. That's actually the elevator there into the core of the Earth. So that was really fun. So we was on the metro, you know, a bunch of geeky-looking guys just kind of standing around. I mean, we didn't stand out at all. When we came off the metro, we came back up, so back out from the Earth's core, back up to the surface of the Earth, you know. And we realized it was absolutely tipping it down with rain. And none of us had an umbrella. And, you know, we were all dressed in the typical fashion, just with hoodies and T-shirts on and stuff. So we knew we were going to get completely soaked. But, thankfully, there was an old lady selling umbrellas. And she had the best day of her life. She this morning, as I came out of the hotel, I'm sure I saw her drive past in a Ferrari. But it might have been a Lamborghini. Anyway. So we came out of the station. You know, we were really hungry. We'd all flown in from various places in the world. So we were walking along, trying to find a restaurant, and that's actually Steve there. Yeah, that's a real scene from last night. But anyway, so I'm Ben Lovell. Some of you may know me already. You can get me on Twitter. You can get me on GitHub too. For any of you that care, this is my timeline on GitHub. This is my shower. So my shower is actually a more prolific contributor to open source than I am. So for any of you people that actually, you know, care about this kind of thing and are hiring people and actually pay attention to this kind of thing, the shower's unemployed. You know, feel free. You can get me on Google Plus as well. Yeah, you can get me on Google Plus. Just take a second to note that down. Actually, take a minute to note that down. There's some pictures of me when I was young, you know. Yeah, the one in the middle, look, I actually grew into those teeth and those ears, but the one on the left, doesn't that look evil? Look, what's the difference? There is none. So the film Chucky was actually about me. I'm a bit of a wizard at programming. That's me there in my wizard beard and hair and stuff. And, you know, I like Visual Basic. I like Visual Basic Professional Edition, Service Pack 6. That was a great service pack. I like Visual Basic 6 Enterprise Edition. No, I don't really. I did used to work for Microsoft for a short period of time, but don't tell anybody about that. I actually work for a small digital agency in Farnham, in England, in the southeast of England, just outside of London, called 1-1. It's a brilliant place to work. We're Rubyists, but we kind of do a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So we do iOS, Android, and a whole bunch of things. It's a lot of fun. This is a picture of Farnham, right near where I work. It's a really nice place. This is me and my friend at work, pair programming. Yeah, you can see us there. Having fun, pair programming away. I've got my glasses on there, and yeah, it's great fun. Sometimes we need to take important business calls. So if we do, don't disturb us. And yeah, he's got a balloon in his hand, I don't know why. So today, I'm going to talk to you. That was the closest likeness that I could get. So I think it looks like me a bit, you know. So I'm going to talk to you today about building awesome JSON APIs. Should be fun. So part of that is, or includes the Rails API stack. So I'm going to talk about the Rails API stack. And what's quite funny about this talk is that the three things that I'm going to speak about, this guy here, Steve Klabnik, is on the core team for all of them. So probably what I'm going to do is just hand the microphone over to Steve. If you give him a round of applause, I'll sit back down. And I'll give you your fee later, Steve. But no, in all seriousness, I'm going to talk about the Rails API stack, which is the Rails that you know and love, or maybe you know and hate, but whatever. We'll leave our prejudice at the door. The Rails that you know and love for API-only applications, so a slimmed-down subset of Rails, which is supposed to be meaner and leaner and greener as well, so it's kinder to the environment. We're going to speak about JSON API, which is your kind of your remedy against bike shedding, if you like. So, you know, don't reinvent the wheel. Let's try and use an established standard for building APIs. There's a whole bunch of reasons why you'd want to do that, and I'll explain those to you shortly. ActiveModel serializers as well, because using to JSON kind of sucks a bit. And, you know, if we can introduce some conventions there, then great, we should do that, because Rails is all about conventions. Briefly, some stuff about HTTP and trying to embody the spirit of using HTTP semantically, and a whole bunch of other shit that is probably too crazy to categorize, like this. I'll stop there and just take a drink quickly, if you don't mind. So I'm going to talk about what I believe are some of the components of good API design. Now, obviously, there's many of them. Excuse me. But I'll posit to you that the three most important are, and wait for it, sorry about that, that they are fast. So fast is probably, describing an API as fast is probably quite a nebulous way to describe an API. Speedy API can take many different forms, right? So one could be, you know, just a high throughput, like fast response time, low latency. But another can be just trying to cut out the amount of HTTP that you need to perform, you know, so caching and conditional requests, those kind of things. They should be standardized, right? You shouldn't, or at least you should try not to reinvent the wheel every time you create an API and publish an API. I probably, or I hope I shouldn't have to explain the benefits or the reasons why you would do that, why you would try to make an API standardized. It opens you up to a whole bunch of things, you know, generalized tooling, you know, open standards for tooling, and frameworks and libraries and tool sets that can consume APIs, but also just so you don't kind of surprise your fellow developer, right? Because we don't like surprises, or some of us don't. They should be intuitive, and again, intuitive could be, you know, can take on many forms. They should be discoverable, right? If you've read or you know about Fielding's thesis, the REST thesis, Fielding actually states that the only thing that you should, or the only thing that you need to know, the only thing that's published about an API should actually be the very first endpoint, just that URI. How do you make an API intuitive? Well, you can use the kind of hypermedia style linking and, you know, state transitions, and there's a whole bunch of techniques that we'll touch on, at least, to discuss that subject. So I'm going to talk to you about JSON API. So JSON API is the standard for building APIs in JSON that kind of, I believe, is managed or maintained by Steve and Yehuda as well. So JSON API is just one of many emerging standards. I mean, the JSON API is fairly mature. I think it's been around for about a year. Yeah. Just about a year. You're going to be involved in this a lot, Steve, so it's great that you're sitting up there. Yeah, so it's been around for about a year. It's an open standard. It's been IANA registered, so there's a designated media type that you can use to sort of identify yourself as using that standard. It's fairly slim, you know, it doesn't dictate too much to you. Most of it's very sane. There are some areas that are kind of still in a state of flux, but mostly it's fairly stable, and it's an API that we've used at 1-1, sorry, at least the standard we've used at 1-1 when shipping APIs. We've consumed them in many different ways, so we've got Ember clients, we've got Android applications, we've got Ruby Motion iOS applications, you know, so it's a nice and consumable and understandable standard. So it advertises itself as your tool against bike shedding, right? Which makes a lot of sense, because if you look around and you look at those published APIs and you look at the responses and you look at the way that you interact with these published APIs, you can pretty much guarantee that they're all different, right? They're all subtly different.
I got an Easter egg for you.
Right.
Back one slide. Okay, check this out, everybody. The logo is not valid JSON.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. Yeah, excellent. You heard it here first. So yeah, the logo isn't actually valid JSON, so nice one, Steve. Yeah, great. So I feel like we're pairing on this now. We're pairing on the talk, yeah. So yeah, so it's your tool against bike shedding. As I said before, it's IANA registered, which kind of means that, you know, it's gone through a certain amount of ratification, if you like. It's a work in progress. You can actually contribute to it yourself, right? You can fork it and you can contribute to it and you can discuss it on GitHub even. So, you know, just briefly, this is kind of a very simple example, just lifted straight from the JSON API website, which you should visit. You know, there's a lot of information in there. It's quite, it's not too dense. It's quite easy to understand. There's good examples in there. This is an example. It's probably not much different from APIs that you've developed or consumed. The standard itself only has very few, or indeed has very few reserved keywords. So some of those include href, ID, and links, I believe. There's not much that it imposes upon you. So you can see here, this is, again, just a simple, but using the link style of associations. So we'll cover this in more detail in a minute. This is all valid JSON, by the way. So you can see one of the things is, and I mean, again, this is a really simple thing, but something that you don't necessarily see in all the APIs around that are published nowadays. Just a difference between using singular and singular resources and resource collections. Just the simple fact of pluralizing the root element is like a really handy standard, a real cool standard, because we've consumed APIs, third-party APIs that don't do this, and it's just a bit of a ball ache, if you like. So yeah, as we say, the difference between the singular resources and resource collections are very minimal. You can define too many relationships in this style. So you can see here that the association just splats out the IDs of the associated resources. So that's the ID style as it's referred to within the spec. And then there's the link style referred to within the spec. And you can see here that it uses a more hypermedia style link to the associated resources. And again, you can see here that the associated resource IDs are exploded out into this URI here. So this uses the shorthand link style, which again, this is another standard, the URI template standard. So this is well known, this is stable, it's a RFC ratified thing. So again, this is something you can use, that you can use generalized tooling for this. There's Ruby libraries for this. There's libraries in every single language out there that use URI templates for expansion for associated resources. So I'm going to stop and give you a quick story again about the Queen of England. Sorry. Queen of England, very quick story, just to give you a break from the heavy stuff. So when I was a junior developer, I was fortunate enough to work on the Queen's actual website, which is royal.gov.uk. And one of the things that I was doing, this was traditional ASP 3.0, well back in the day, you know. I didn't have a beard then. way back in the day. So I was the lead on this project, and I was working away on the CMS feature that managed all of their content for their website. Now, one of the things that you probably don't know about the English royal family, which was news to me at the time, was that the people that maintain their obituaries, you know, so the stories that get published to the press when they die, actually, every week update their obituaries, right? So they keep their obituaries up to date, just in case one of them should die. Well, you can guess what happened. Maybe you can't, but I'll tell you anyway. I went home after a nice long week of work of patching this part of the CMS and got a call to say that you have actually killed the whole royal family. Now, the bug that I wrote in this software caused all of the obituaries of the royal family to be published simultaneously over the weekend when nobody was in work. One of the I guess the less respected media outlets in London actually ran with this and published a story saying some of the royal family had died, and it was my fault. So anyway, I did warn you there was going to be some strange stuff. Back to JSON API. I know, a perfect seg, right? It was a perfect seg. Back to JSON API. So compound documents, because, you know, having an adopted standard for retrieving associated resources within one round trip is great, right? Because the fastest HTTP is no HTTP at all. So the JSON API standard dictates a bunch of, or a way to do that, to include associated resources, and you can go down the sort of rabbit hole, if you like, with nested associations, and that's great. And it produces JSON, or at least it should produce JSON similar to this style. So another nice ability for you to offer to consumers of your API is the ability to dictate sparse field sets. So there is a standard within a JSON API that allows you to specify just those fields that you're interested in for a particular resource, which is great. So just to limit the payload. HTTP semantics, right? So this is really important. So if you're developing an API, and this isn't something really that the JSON API dictates, it's just a general point really. If you're developing an API, do it with, be sympathetic to HTTP semantics. Don't surprise people, right? That means use the right response codes. That means use the right verbs. That means use the kind of almost agreed and accepted headers for sending information up to the API, and obviously retrieving responses from that. Now, these guys, MailChimp API, mostly RESTful API, all API calls should be made with POST. Yes. You can consider any non-200 HTTP response code an error. Yeah. So that's not a very good example of what you should be doing with APIs. Now I'm going to show you a bunch of status dogs and cats for no other reason than they're quite cool. So there's 200, okay, you know, so there's 201 created. Oh. There's 204, no content. And that was a whistle-stop tour of the JSON API with a bunch of other stuff. So now Rails API, right? So I love Rails. Yes, I really do. I love Rails. I love Ruby. So before I say anything else, I'm just going to say I really do love Ruby, and I'm going to have a bit of fun, so indulge me if you like. So you've probably heard this statement before. Ruby's not as slow as you might think. It's actually slower. So how do we make Ruby fast? By running less Ruby. It seems obvious, right? So, knowing that, how do we make Rails fast? Can you guess? By running less Rails. Derp. I heard you like Rails, so I took some Rails out of your Rails so you could Rails a bit faster than usual. So, by default, Rails loads up a whole bunch of middlewares in this application that I've called Kitchen Sink full of kitchen sinks. Loads up a whole bunch of middlewares that in an API-only scenario you're probably not very interested in, right? And you might have heard this expression, it's an idiomatic thing, everything but the kitchen sink, right? So the Rails API stack, by default, does slim down a bunch of those middlewares. So when you Rails API and new up an API-only application, the default stack of middlewares are these. So you can see here the grayed out ones. Oh gosh, the grayed out ones are the ones that aren't included by default. And again, of course, you can trim those down even further should there be things that you don't actually need in there. So that's one form. So again, loading all of the rail ties for rails. So there's a bunch of stuff that you wouldn't need in an API-only environment, right? So you don't have to require rails all. You can be specific. So you might not want to load Action Mailer. You might not want to load sprockets. You almost certainly don't want to load the view engines and stuff, right? You would just want to trim down that stack as much as possible to eke as much performance out of it as possible. You can see here, this is the ancestors of the API controller. This is the difference between that and the default stack of ties that you get with a default Rails stack, you know, with the view engines and everything else. So you might think, well, why not use Sinatra, right? Why not use one of the kind of more micro frameworky services? And that's a good question. Well, one of the things, actually, before I do that, I'll just explain a few things. So Sinatra is maintained by Konstantin Haas, who's a good friend of mine. According to this application that I've got on my iPhone, he looks most like Michelle Pfeiffer. I'm not really seeing it myself. And in fact, the app actually only rated itself half a star for likeness. It's like, get the fuck out of here. So why don't you use Sinatra? Well, you know, and I'm sure any of you that have used Sinatra before in anger have come across the same kind of thing. Any sufficiently advanced Sinatra application is indistinguishable from Rails. So what you end up doing is reinventing the wheel everywhere, right? And I mean, there's even frameworks that have kind of attempt to make Sinatra, or give Sinatra more structure, right? More conventions-based services for things like organizing your views and almost breaking out like Sinatra roots into controller style things. I mean, like Padrino's one of them, right? But you all know what this is, right? It's a wheel. So don't reinvent it. Use what you know. Use Rails that can get you started really quickly. You know, we all know and we're all familiar with Rails. So stick with Rails. And by all accounts, when your Rails application gets too big, as no doubt it will, and turns into a behemoth that tries to kill you and your colleagues, split it out into smaller services as and when you see fit. So the last piece of the puzzle is ActiveModel Serializers. So ActiveModel Serializers is a more convention-based way of dealing with outputting JSON and converting your models into JSON. So the kind of Rails way, if you like, is to use JBuilder, which was created by this guy. I don't know if any of you, do you know this guy's name? Anyone here? He actually just recently changed his name to Basecamp. So if you didn't know that, you do now. So yeah, so you know, the JBuilder is actually nice, you know, but you can see here, I mean, or you can see behind the troll guy, or here, DHH wasn't troll guy, by the way, it was the other guy. So you can see here that there's a lot of noise there, right? I mean, we shouldn't have to be dealing with this kind of stuff today. You know, we use conventions where we can, and we try to infer the structure of the JSON that we're outputting as best we can, right? And there's techniques for doing that, and ActiveModel Serializers tries to do that. So he changed his name to Basecamp. So troll guy. So, you know, why not use a more convention-based approach? So ActiveModel Serializers, you drop it into your gem file, you rouse G, you know, you generate a serializer, and it produces I mean, this is obviously like a slightly filled out version. So you have kind of like a one-to-one mapping between your resources, or in this case, your models, to your serializers. Although you don't have to, obviously you can override that. The serializers themselves are, or the actual type of serializer, or the instance of the serializer is inferred from your model name as well, so there's a convention there already. And you can see here, just to produce that same structure of JSON output, that we've gone down from like 10 or 20 lines to just a couple of lines, very conventional. It reads like a very nice, understandable DSL. It's pretty cool. So there's a bunch of tricks that you can do, you know, so you can specify attributes that will just get mapped directly to the attributes of your model instance, and you can override those behaviors as well, so you can do cool things like truncating stuff, and there's a few tricks in there. So object obviously refers to the instance of the thing that's being serialized, so like the root instance. Scope is something that you can manage that generally would refer to the current underscore user. And you know, using the serializer is as simple as this. So it's, as I said before, the actual type of the serializer is inferred from the type of the model that you're responding with. So just be conventional, you know, use those conventions. This feels to me much more rousey, you know, much more honest to the kind of rouse conventions and the rouse mindset. Another benefit of this, obviously, is you cut out the view layer, right, which is traditionally quite slow. Not in all cases, but mostly. But there's a warning, right? So these things, without going unchecked, they can get quickly, they get out of hand quite quickly. And congratulations, you just serialized your whole database, which is like one of the junior guys in our team was like merrily plugging away and working on an API, and he's a really good guy, really smart guy, and he's like, wow, these ActiveModel serializers, they're great. Like, look at this. And he literally had produced the response from hell that was about 8 megabytes. No joke. It actually crashed an iPhone when we tested it. It was awesome. So another, this is as a bit of an aside, so performing conditional requests is a really cool thing, a really nice thing that you can add to your API that really makes your consumers happy and just cuts down on kind of superfluous or unnecessary responses, And obviously Rails, if you've used Rails before, Rails provides us all of the infrastructure to do that quite nicely, and of course the Rails API stack does too. So if you were to retrieve this resource, initially you'd get back a 200, and you'd get an E tag, and you'd get the last modified. And then if you go to retrieve it again, you pass in the header, if none match, and then the E tag there, you would pass in. I didn't put it there in this instance because it would have messed up my slide. And of course, Rails, doing this in the Rails API, and this is a reason to use Rails API again, or to use Rails generally, is that a lot of this sugar, right? A lot of these conventions are here for us already, and they're just as simple as this. So what this will do is you make your request to the API. Rails is smart enough to know that the E tag's changed or the modified's changed, and will convert that to that request, or at least respond with a not modified, and everybody's happy. So there's caching, or at least there was caching in ActiveModel serializers. It was quite simple to use. Steve will probably be able to explain this better than me, but I believe it felt like a bit of a wart on the design of ActiveModel serializers, perhaps, or there were many strategies that weren't necessarily catered for, or I guess really, to me personally, it doesn't necessarily feel the most natural place to kind of jimmy in a caching sort of framework or layer, right? The responsibilities of serializers should be to serialize your model instances to JSON. I don't know if it's coming back, of course, as I say. It's not there at the moment, but we'll see anyway. Steve might be able to give us some light on that. So, of course, you can use gateway caching, which comes outside of the, this is stuff that most of you probably have dealt with before. This is something that you've used in your applications before, even regular applications that use the full Rails stack. So the testability side of APIs, right? So these are going to be opinions. This is my approach. This is our approach at 1-1. It's something that works for us, right? We test the whole stack. We don't use many mocks. We don't use many stubs. We only stub or mock or fake out the service interactions for services that we don't own. We tend to use VCR for those kind of things, or webmock, or one of those kind of that kind of ilk of tool. Obviously, using rack test, so we exercise the whole stack, right? So you think when you're testing something, you provide a known set of inputs, and you assert on the outputs, right? So the inputs would be things like headers, the actual serialized body, of your request, so the JSON in the request, and the response would be, again, headers, status codes, and the serialized output. So just as a very rough example, this is we use RSpec, and we use the kind of feature style specs for exercising our API endpoints. It's quite nice. It kind of reads like decent English. It's not quite Cucumber. Good friend of mine, Matt Wynne, who I used to work with at the BBC, is one of the core folks on Cucumber, and we've had many interesting discussions. I'm not a massive fan of Cucumber, but I will say in the API scenario, it can kind of make sense. It's a nice way to describe your APIs and test your APIs, using kind of English language or indeed whatever language you use. So you might think that after all of that, the JSON API plus the Rails API plus ActiveModel serializers equals prizes, profit, beer, gifts, and hearts. Well, it does, and it doesn't, right? This is only one stack, right? This is only one collection of tools. One of the great things about our ecosystem is you can almost guarantee that for each of those individual gems, for each of those individual technology stacks, there are a million alternatives. So feel free to use what you're comfortable with, but remembering that adhering to standards, adhering to known standards, and using conventions and all of those kind of smart things along the way are going to help you and the consumers of your APIs. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't go into. Again, probably stuff that might come down to more opinionated decisions, things about, let's just say, versioning is probably a tough one to tackle, right? So I've not got any strong feelings about versioning, whether you do it in the accepts header or whether you version based on your URIs. Some people really don't like that approach. We have a mix of both in the APIs that we've developed at 1-1, but we do tend to favor the accepts header and passing through the version there. Authentication, again, we probably don't need to talk too much about that. You use token-based authentication, or you use basic digest authentication, or you use OpenAuth, as long as you're exposing your API endpoints over SSL only, which you probably should be doing anyway, and which I hope all of you do. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we didn't discuss, but I'm sure if you get me drunk enough tonight, I will talk about anything to any one of you. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening to me today.